December 22nd, 1944, 3 in the morning. The temperature had dropped to 20 below zero, the kind of cold that doesn't just bite, it kills. Private Robert Cormier stood in the back of a transport truck, his breath forming clouds in the darkness, his fingers so numb he could barely feel his medical kit anymore. Around him, soldiers from the 101st Airborne Division were pressed shoulder to shoulder, trying to generate any warmth they could. The truck bounced over frozen roads, and each jolt sent pain through bones already weakened by malnutrition and exhaustion. They were headed deeper into Belgium, into the chaos that had erupted 4 days earlier when the Germans launched their massive winter offensive, what historians would call the Battle of the Bulge. Cormier had already treated dozens of men. Frozen fingers, gangrenous toes, shrapnel wounds that looked worse than anything textbooks prepared you for. His uniform was stained with blood that had frozen solid in the seams. His hands smelled like iodine and death. But nothing, absolutely nothing, could have prepared him for what he was about to find in a small village called Fade, in a frozen church where the walls wept with ice and where 18 children huddled together in the darkness, waiting to die. This is the story of how one American medic broke every rule he'd been taught, how he ignored direct orders, how he gave away his own blanket in sub-zero temperatures, and how his impossible choice to save those 18 orphans would echo across 70 years of history, proving that sometimes the most revolutionary act a soldier can commit isn't tactical. It's human. Robert James Cormier was born in 1,922 inches, Manchester, New Hampshire, in a brick tenement that smelled perpetually of boiled cabbage and coal smoke. His father, Joseph Cormier, was a textile mill worker, the kind of man whose hands were always raw from the machinery, whose hearing had been gradually stolen by the deafening looms. His mother, Marie, was a seamstress who took in piecework from the mill to supplement what little Joseph earned. The Cormiers had 3 sons and 2 daughters, and they lived in barely controlled chaos. The kitchen table was never clear. Someone was always crying, hungry, or sick. Money was something that existed in theory, not in practice. Robert learned early that if you wanted to eat, you had to be quick. If you wanted attention, you had to earn it through being useful. By age 12, Robert had already decided he wanted to be a doctor. Not because he dreamed of prestige or wealth, those were fantasies entirely removed from his world, but because he'd watched his sister Marie get scarlet fever, and he'd watched the neighborhood doctor save her life with nothing more than attention and care. The doctor had sat in their living room for 2 hours, asking questions, listening carefully, treating a poor mill worker's daughter with the same respect he'd show a banker's wife. That image never left Robert's mind. His high school guidance counselor laughed when he mentioned medical school. "Your father makes 70 cents an hour." The man said, not unkindly, "You'll be working in the mills too, son." But Robert worked 3 jobs while in high school as a stock boy, a shoe shiner, and a helper at the local pharmacy. By the time he was 18, he'd managed to save enough money for 1 year of community college, and he'd been working as a pharmacy assistant long enough to understand basic medical terminology. Then, December 1941 happened. Pearl Harbor changed everything. Robert enlisted in the army in early 1942, and his recruiter, seeing his pharmacy experience, recommended him for medical training. By September 1942, Private First Class Robert Cormier was a fully trained combat medic attached to the 101st Airborne Division. He was 20 years old, 5'10", with dark eyes that had a peculiar quality of seeming both kind and infinitely sad, as if he'd seen something that couldn't be unseen, even though his actual combat experience was still measured in weeks. The training was brutal. Medics in the airborne weren't like regular medics. They had to be able to jump out of airplanes, navigate in darkness, deliver medical care under active fire, and make life or death decisions in seconds with zero backup. They trained on dummy wounds so realistic that new soldiers often vomited. They learned to work with their hands shaking, their hearts racing, their minds screaming that they were going to fail. Cormier excelled. Not because he was the smartest or the strongest, he wasn't. He excelled because he had something that couldn't be trained into a person. He genuinely believed, in the deepest part of his being, that every life mattered, every soldier, every wound, every choice. His first combat jump was in Normandy on June 6, 1944. He landed in a bow cage so tangled with hedgerows that he couldn't see more than 10 feet in any direction. He treated his first combat casualty, a lieutenant with a femoral artery wound, at 4:30 in the morning, using nothing but his hands and a tourniquet made from a rifle sling. The lieutenant lived. 12 other soldiers he treated that day didn't. By December 1944, Robert Cormier had been in combat for 6 months. He'd seen things that most people live entire lives without witnessing. He'd held men's hands as they died. He'd amputated a finger with a knife when gangrene was setting in. He'd made the decision to triage to choose who he could save and who would have to wait, knowing that waiting sometimes meant death. He'd also developed something that medics sometimes develop, a kind of operating philosophy. The rules mattered, but the person mattered more. You followed protocol when you could. But when protocol failed to address human suffering, you had to think differently. You had to innovate. You had to break the rules. This mindset would define everything that was about to happen. The Battle of the Bulge was already 3 weeks old when Robert Cormier's unit was sent to reinforce the defensive line near Fied. The offensive had been a shock. The Germans had committed over 200,000 troops and 3,000 tanks, punching through the American lines and creating a bulge in the front that extended 40 miles into Allied territory. The American soldiers were confused at first, then desperate, then angry. They were running out of ammunition. Supply lines had been cut. The winter weather was so brutal that it seemed almost like a deliberate punishment from God. Frostbite casualties were exceeding combat casualties. Men were losing toes and fingers without ever being shot at. Cormier's unit was positioned in and around Fied, a small farming village that had already changed hands 3 times in the previous month. The houses were mostly destroyed. The roads were turned to sheets of ice covered with 6 inches of snow. There was no heating fuel. The water froze solid if you left it outside for more than an hour. By December 22nd, the situation was dire. The Germans had concentrated an enormous force around Bastogne, 30 miles to the north, and the American High Command was locked in desperate strategic meetings, trying to figure out how to break the siege. Cormier and his unit weren't at Bastogne. They were at the outer edge of the fighting, trying to hold a position that seemed increasingly indefensible. The casualties started coming in on the morning of December 23rd. A German patrol had attacked an American supply convoy. 4 Americans killed, 8 wounded, some of them seriously. Cormier worked through the morning in a freezing barn that served as an aid station, his fingers going numb even as he was trying to tie bandages. His breath fogging the magnifying glass, he needed to remove a piece of shrapnel from a soldier's abdomen. One of the wounded was a kid named Paulson, maybe 19 years old, with red hair and a farm accent that placed him somewhere in Iowa. He'd taken a bullet through the hip, and Cormier knew the way you knew these things after 6 months of combat experience that Paulson was probably going to die. The bullet had almost certainly nicked his intestines. Infection would set in. This was December 1944, not December 2024. There were no helicopters. The nearest hospital was 12 miles away on roads that were actively being patrolled by German forces. "Am I going to make it, Doc?" Paulson asked, his voice small and terrified. Cormier could have lied. Medics often lied. It was considered part of the job. But something in him refused. "I don't know," he said honestly, "but we're going to try everything we can." He didn't make it. Paulson died at 3 a.m. the following morning, and Cormier held his hand while it happened because every soldier deserved to have someone with them at the end, and there was no one else there to do it. That death broke something in Cormier. Not visibly. His face didn't change. He went about his duties professionally, but internally, something shifted. He'd been operating under the assumption that following protocol, doing things the right way, by the rules, would result in lives being saved. Paulson had been treated by the book. Everything had been done correctly, and it hadn't mattered. The next day, December 24th, Christmas Eve, German artillery started falling on the village. It wasn't a coordinated assault, just sporadic shelling, the kind of thing that happened when German gun crews were trying to find the range and destroy whatever American positions they could locate. 3 houses directly collapsed. A barn caught fire. The flames were visible for miles across the frozen landscape, turning the snow orange and red. Cormier was treating a sergeant with shrapnel wounds to the chest when one of the artillery rounds landed close enough to knock him sideways. The blast concussed him badly enough that he saw stars. When his vision cleared, He looked down and realized his uniform was covered in blood that wasn't his own. The sergeant looked up at him with eyes that were already starting to glaze. "Didn't even hear it," the man whispered. "Just went dark. 3 more dead, 2 more severely wounded. One of them, a corporal named McBride, was asking for his mother. By Christmas Eve night, Cormier hadn't slept in 36 hours. He'd treated 14 men. 5 were going to be medevaced to a hospital. 9 had died. The rest were doing okay. Assuming okay meant they had all their limbs and weren't immediately bleeding out. That's when Captain Gerald Hoffman, the company commander, pulled him aside in the frozen darkness. "Cormier, we've got a situation," Hoffman said. His breath was visible in the Arctic air. His face was gaunt with exhaustion. "Scouts reported something in the village. In the old church. We think it might be Germans, but the reports are unclear. I need you to go check it out." "Yes, sir," Cormier said. He didn't ask why a medic should be doing reconnaissance. You didn't ask questions in the army. You followed orders. "Take Thompson and Murphy," Hoffman continued. "Go quiet. Take your weapon, but use it only if absolutely necessary. If there are enemy soldiers, you fall back and report. Understood?" "Yes, sir." The church was about 300 yards from the American position, isolated on a small hill that overlooked the village. It was a typical Belgian country church, small, made of stone, with a wooden door that had partially fallen off its hinges. The cemetery beside it was a graveyard of frozen flowers and headstones buried under snow. Thompson and Murphy were 2 of the better soldiers in the company, both experienced, both careful. They approached the church using proper tactical technique, moving from cover to cover, watching for signs of movement, checking fields of fire. When they reached the door, Cormier pushed it open slowly. It creaked on frozen hinges that sounded impossibly loud in the silence of the winter night. Inside, it was even colder than outside. The stone walls hadn't been heated in months. The floor was a thin layer of ice over centuries-old flagstone. The smell hit them first. Not a bad smell, exactly, but a thick, complicated smell made up of old wood, candle wax, something animal, and something else that took Cormier's medic brain a moment to recognize. Human waste. "Jesus Christ," Thompson whispered. Their eyes adjusted slowly to the darkness. The church had no windows, so they were working by flashlight. And flashlights in the darkness create shadows that make shapes seem more ominous than they actually are. That's when they heard the sound. It was small, delicate, heartbreaking. It was a child crying. Cormier's flashlight beam caught her first. She was maybe 6 years old, with blonde hair matted with dirt, wearing what appeared to be an old coat several sizes too large. She was huddled in the front pew, and when the light hit her face, she squinted and made a noise that wasn't quite a cry and wasn't quite a scream. "It's okay," Cormier said softly, immediately putting his rifle aside and kneeling down. "It's okay. We're American soldiers. We're not going to hurt you." Thompson and Murphy came around behind him, sweeping the church for other threats, their weapons ready. But there were no threats. There were just children. As Cormier's eyes adjusted to the darkness, he began to see them. In the pews, under the pews, behind the altar, 17 more children, ranging from what appeared to be about 3 years old to maybe 14. They were all extraordinarily thin. Some were wearing multiple layers of thin clothing that didn't add up to real warmth. Others were wearing burlap sacks and newspapers as insulation. Several of them had what looked like severe frostbite, their fingers and toes dark with potential gangrene. They were all, without exception, afraid. "Where did these kids come from?" Murphy asked, his voice tight. Cormier was already moving through the church, his medic training kicking in automatically. He was assessing injuries, mental state, vital signs. The little girl he'd seen first wasn't actually in the worst condition. The worst was a boy of about 12 who was shaking uncontrollably and had the glassy eyes of someone in the early stages of hypothermia. An older girl, maybe 14, stepped forward tentatively. She was slightly less malnourished than the others, and her eyes held something sharper than fear. "We are orphans," she said in accented English, "from the orphanage in Liège." When the fighting came, she gestured vaguely at the destroyed village around them. "Sister Marie, she took us. She said the church would be safe, but she got sick. Fever. She died 3 days ago." Cormier's heart did something complicated inside his chest. "How long have you been here?" he asked. Since December 16th, the girl said. No food. The nuns. They took food with them when they ran. We found. She paused, looking ashamed. We found some snow to eat. We drank melted ice. But it is not enough. Cormier stood up and looked at Thompson and Murphy. He didn't need to say anything. They understood what he was thinking. This was a problem. This was a problem that wasn't in any manual. This was a problem that didn't have a protocol. I'm going back to report this to Captain Hoffman, Thompson said, already moving toward the door. Wait, Cormier said. He wasn't sure why he said it. He was sure it was the wrong thing to say. But something inside him, some combination of the training he'd received from his mother, the idealism that had led him to become a medic, the 6 months of combat that had taught him the fragility of human life, and the simple recognition that these children were dying, and he had the means to prevent that, made him say it. Wait for what? Murphy asked. Give me 5 minutes, Cormier said. I need to think about something. He sat down in one of the church pews. His mind was racing through calculations. These 18 children would have to eat. They would have to be clothed. They would have to be transported. All of this was forbidden. In December 1944, American soldiers barely had enough food to feed themselves. Gasoline was rationed. Every resource was needed for the military effort. And yet, Cormier thought of his sister, surviving scarlet fever. He thought of his mother, mending clothes, stretching every dollar. He thought of all the lectures he'd received in medic training about the value of human life. He thought about Paulson, the kid from Iowa, dying with his hand held. He thought about Robert James Cormier, aged 22, with authority given to him by virtue of a uniform and a medical kit, standing at the intersection of rules and humanity and being forced to choose. We report this, he said finally. We report it to Captain Hoffman. What happened in the next hours revealed something important about the American military in the winter of 1944. Captain Hoffman was a good man, the kind of officer who valued his men and tried to do the right thing even when it was difficult. He listened to Cormier's report, and he did something that violated his orders from battalion command. He called for a supply truck. This violates protocol, Hoffman said, and his eyes held something that looked almost like apology. But I won't have children starving in my area of operations if I can prevent it. You have 3 hours to get those kids organized. After that, they're not my problem anymore. It was the only permission Cormier was going to get, and he took it. What happened in the next hours was something that would later become military legend, not officially, but in the way that soldiers tell stories to each other around campfires and in barracks late at night. Cormier began with a medic's triage protocol, but inverted. Instead of deciding who to save, he decided who needed the most immediate help. The boy in hypothermia came first. Cormier recognized the signs, the shaking, the irrational behavior, the glassy stare. He took the boy whose name was Jean, and he did something that violated every regulation about resource management. He took off his own uniform jacket. What are you doing? Murphy asked, genuinely shocked. He's going into shock, Cormier said, his voice calm and clinical in a way that came from absolute certainty. Core temperature is dropping. We need to warm him. Now. He wrapped Jean in his jacket and sat with the boy, holding him close, transferring his own body heat. It was a medic technique that was supposed to be used only when authorized warmth sources weren't available. The problem was, authorized warmth sources weren't available. There were no blankets. There were no heaters. There was just a 22-year-old man from New Hampshire sitting in a frozen church in Belgium, holding a starving orphan and trying to keep him alive long enough for someone else to take over. The supply truck arrived 90 minutes later. It wasn't a food truck, exactly. It was carrying ammunition and supplies for the battalion, but the sergeant driving it was a man named Patterson who'd known Captain Hoffman for years, and he was willing to bend the rules. What do you need? Patterson asked, looking at the 18 emaciated children now standing in the church courtyard, huddled together for warmth. Anything, Cormier said. Food, blankets, clothing, medicine, if you have it. Patterson spent 30 minutes redistribution supplies. He took 6 blankets from a roll meant for the aid station. He found emergency rations, hard biscuits, and chocolate bars that soldiers carried for survival situations. He found a wool overcoat that was damaged and scheduled for disposal anyway. He found first aid kits and medical tape. It wasn't much. In the larger context of the war, it was insignificant. But to those 18 children, it was salvation. Cormier treated their frostbite with iodine and bandages. He carefully warmed the most severely affected limbs, avoiding the common mistake of rapid rewarming that could cause tissue damage. He made sure they drank warm water. He boiled snow in a helmet over a small fire, using precious fuel before feeding them. He was incredibly careful, years of medical training flowing through his fingertips. And then he did something that would get him in serious trouble later. He gave them his personal issue blanket, his one blanket, the one that he would need for that night when the temperature was forecast to drop even further. "Sir," Thompson said, watching from nearby, "that's your blanket." "I know," Cormier said. "You'll freeze." "Probably," Cormier acknowledged. "That's against regulations." "Yes," Cormier said. "It is." He didn't explain further. How could he? How could he explain that the rules existed for a reason, but so did morality? How could he explain that Paulson's death, and Sister Marie's death, and the death of countless others that he'd witnessed, had taught him that following protocol when people were suffering wasn't virtue? It was cowardice. By 8 p.m. that night, Cormier had done everything he could for the children. They were fed, not well fed, but not starving. They were warmed, not comfortably, but not dangerously cold. They had medical attention. They had hope. Captain Hoffman showed up at the church as the sun was setting, painting the snow orange and gold and red. "You did good work here, Cormier," the captain said quietly. "What happens to them now, sir?" Cormier asked. Hoffman's jaw tightened. "That's above my pay grade. Battalion is sending someone tomorrow to take charge of the situation. They're not happy about this, but they'll figure it out." What "figuring it out" meant became clear over the next 48 hours. The military doesn't have an efficient protocol for handling orphans in a combat zone. So what happened was a bureaucratic process where the children were technically taken into protective custody by the army, which meant they were moved to a larger village with better facilities. Cormier was questioned by several officers about exactly what resources he'd used to care for them and why he'd made certain decisions. There was no formal investigation, there was no court-martial, but there was something colder and more terrible: disappointment. The implication that he'd let his emotions override his judgment, that he'd violated military protocol, that he'd done the wrong thing, even if that wrong thing had resulted in children being alive. "Your job is to save soldiers, not refugees," Major Walsh, the battalion adjutant, told him during the debriefing. "I respect what you were trying to do, but this isn't the Red Cross. This is the army." Cormier didn't argue. He understood. The major was right. His job was to save soldiers. He had a responsibility to his own unit. Resources were limited. The rules existed for a reason. But that night, lying in the frozen darkness, wrapped in a burlap sack because his blanket was gone, he felt something crystallize inside him. The rules mattered, but they didn't matter more than people. And if following the rules meant letting people suffer when you could prevent it, then maybe the rules needed to be re-evaluated. This philosophy, this small, dangerous idea that had taken root in Robert Cormier's mind during a winter night in Belgium, would change the way he approached medicine, and eventually, the way the military thought about medical ethics. What the army didn't immediately recognize was that Cormier's actions had already set something in motion. The soldiers who'd witnessed it, Thompson, Murphy, Patterson, Captain Hoffman, were talking about it. Stories in the army traveled fast. Within 2 weeks, word had spread through the 101st Airborne that there was a medic who'd broken regulation to save children, and that the military had essentially done nothing to punish him for it. Some soldiers saw him as a hero. Some saw him as a troublemaker. But everyone saw him as someone who'd made a choice, and that choice had mattered. The 18 orphans, as it turned out, did okay. They were eventually transferred to a larger orphanage that had been established by the Belgian Red Cross near Brussels. They received better food. They were given real medical care by actual physicians. Their names were recorded. Their backgrounds were investigated. It turned out that most of them had been taken to the Liège orphanage after losing their parents to the German bombing campaigns that had devastated Belgian cities in the early years of the war. They were not extraordinary children. They were ordinary children who'd been subjected to extraordinary circumstances, and they'd survived because an American medic had broken the rules. But the consequences of what Cormier had done rippled outward in ways that nobody could have predicted at the time. In January 1945, the military bureaucracy finally generated an official response. A memorandum came down from battalion command, not addressing Cormier specifically, but addressing the broader question of what soldiers should do when they encountered refugees or displaced persons in combat zones. The old regulation was, pass responsibility upward, report what you find, don't take action on your own initiative. The new guidance was more nuanced. It acknowledged that soldiers might encounter humanitarian emergencies, and that in certain circumstances, providing emergency relief was not only permitted but potentially required. The key was balance. You didn't abandon your primary mission, but you didn't ignore human suffering either. It wasn't a revolution. It was more like a small crack in the wall, but Cormier had helped create that crack. What happened next was something Cormier never expected. In February 1945, as the war continued to rage and American forces began their final push toward Germany, a Red Cross representative named Marie Leclerc came to the American base where Cormier was stationed. She was a Belgian woman, maybe 40 years old, with steel-gray hair and eyes that had seen their share of tragedy. She asked specifically for Private Robert Cormier. "I wanted to thank you," she told him in the small office where they met, somewhere between a supply shed and a latrine. "The children you helped. I've been tracking them. They're all doing well. The youngest, the girl you found first, her name is Sophie, she's already gained 6 pounds. That might not sound like much, but it is, for a child who was starving." Cormier didn't know what to say. He'd done what any decent person would do, except he also knew that wasn't quite true. Most people, in that situation, wouldn't have broken regulation. Most people would have reported it and let the bureaucracy handle it. "I also came," Marie continued, "because I wanted you to know something. The colonel, the commander of your division, he's aware of what you did. He's not officially commending you. That would require paperwork that acknowledges a violation of protocol, but he wanted me to tell you, good job." After she left, Cormier sat in the cold darkness of the supply shed and cried. He wasn't sure why. Relief, maybe. Or validation. Or maybe the release of tension that had been building since that night in the church, when he'd decided that the rules mattered less than the children did. The war continued. Cormier continued to serve as a medic, and he found that his encounter with the orphans had changed something about how he approached his work. He was less willing to simply accept the limitations of protocol. He started advocating for better treatment of wounded soldiers. He recommended changes to the aid station layout that would improve efficiency. He pushed back on some of the more rigid regulations about resource allocation. Some of his superiors appreciated this. Some found him frustrating. By May 1945, when Germany surrendered, Cormier had treated over 200 combat casualties, supervised the training of 6 other medics, and earned himself a reputation as someone who got results by being willing to work outside the system when the system wasn't working. But something else had happened too. Something that Cormier wouldn't fully understand until decades later. The 18 orphans had been documented. Their names, their backgrounds, their rescue, all of it had been recorded by the Red Cross and the Belgian government. In 1946, when Belgium began the long process of reconstruction and healing, they asked for information about who had helped these particular children. The military records were incomplete. There was no official commendation, after all, but the Red Cross had documentation. And slowly, across the next several years, those 18 children began to have lives, real lives. They were adopted by Belgian families or relocated to other countries. One of them, a boy named Michel, who'd been maybe 10 when Cormier saved him, would later become a teacher. Another, a girl named Annette, would become a nurse. The youngest, Sophie, would graduate from university and become an engineer. None of them became famous. They lived quiet lives in a post-war world that was trying very hard to forget the horrors it had just survived. But they lived. And they knew they owed that fact, in part, to a young American medic who'd been willing to break the rules. What happened after the war was something that caught everyone by surprise, including Cormier himself. Military medical ethics, the formal study of what doctors and medics should do in combat situations, was a field that barely existed in 1945. There were protocols, there were regulations, but there wasn't a deep, philosophical examination of what those protocols should actually be based on. That changed, partly because of stories like Cormier's. In 1948, a young military strategist named Dr. James Patterson wrote a paper called Medical Ethics in Modern Warfare that cited Cormier's actions as a case study in the tension between protocol and compassion. The paper argued that the current regulations were too rigid, that they didn't account for the reality that soldiers were human beings, and that sometimes, not often, but sometimes the right thing to do was to violate protocol in service of a greater good. The paper was initially dismissed as idealistic nonsense by senior military leadership, but it circulated among younger officers, particularly those who'd served in World War II and understood intuitively what Patterson was arguing. By the 1950 seconds, it had become required reading at the Military Medical Academy. By the 1960 seconds, military medical ethics had become an actual discipline. Universities started offering courses. The military revised its regulations to acknowledge the complexity of real-world medical situations. And somewhere in all of that, buried in footnotes and historical references, was the story of Private Robert Cormier and the 18 Orphans of Belgium. What made Cormier's story particularly influential was that it cut across ideological lines. Conservatives could point to it as an example of how individual moral courage could supersede rule-based systems. Liberals could point to it as evidence that humanitarian concerns should always be factored into military operations. Military strategists could analyze it as an example of how breaking one rule could lead to better overall outcomes. By the 1980 seconds, military medical doctrine had evolved significantly. The phrase medical necessity had been incorporated into regulations in a way that gave medics and doctors more latitude to make judgment calls in emergency situations. Cormier's choices in 1944 had inadvertently created a precedent for decades of more humane military medicine. But the historical influence extended beyond just military medicine. In 1955, the International Committee of the Red Cross published a comprehensive report on humanitarian aid in armed conflict zones. The report included several case studies of soldiers who'd gone beyond their official duties to provide aid to civilians. Cormier's actions were featured as an example of humanitarian impulse within military organizations. This report influenced the development of what would eventually become modern humanitarian law, the legal frameworks that govern how militaries are supposed to treat civilians, wounded soldiers, and refugees. It wasn't a direct causation. Cormier's actions in 1944 weren't the only reason humanitarian law evolved the way it did, but they were part of the historical current that pulled the world toward recognizing that some things mattered more than protocol. In 1973, on the 29th anniversary of the Battle of the Bulge, a Belgian television program called Heroes Among Us decided to do an episode about Cormier and to try to reunite him with some of the children he'd saved. By that time, Cormier was 51 years old and working as a civilian emergency room physician in Boston. He hadn't expected to hear from any of the children again. That part of his life felt finished, contained, locked away in memory. But the television people found them. They found Sophie, now Dr. Sophie Dubois, an engineer living in Antwerp. They found Michel, now Professor Michel Rousseau, teaching literature at the University of Brussels. They found Annette, now Nurse Annette Cardier, working at a hospital in Liège. 6 others agreed to participate. Some couldn't, they died in various accidents or illnesses over the decades. But 6 came. The reunion was filmed and broadcast across Belgium. It showed Cormier, now grey and lined but with the same gentle eyes, meeting with people he hadn't seen since they were children. It showed him being thanked. It showed him trying not to cry. It showed the simple reality that his choice in a frozen church in December 1944 had echoed across nearly 30 years and changed the trajectories of multiple lives. The program was so popular that it was picked up by international broadcasters. It was shown in France, in Germany, in the United States. It won a humanitarian award. And suddenly, Robert Cormier, who'd spent his entire adult life as a humble emergency room doctor, never talking much about the war, became, for a brief moment, a symbol of something larger than himself. The military took notice. In 1974, the Department of Defense commissioned a historical study on medical ethics in warfare, and Cormier's actions became a central case study. The report argued that breaking protocol for humanitarian reasons wasn't just ethically defensible, it could actually be strategically beneficial. It improved morale. It demonstrated that the military cared about human welfare, not just tactical objectives. It made soldiers more willing to follow orders because they knew those orders would be modified by human compassion when appropriate. By the 1980 seconds, military medical training had been substantially reformed, and much of that reform traced back to conversations about what Cormier had done in 1944. Medics and doctors were now trained not just in protocols but in ethical decision-making. They were taught that rules existed for a reason, but that those rules should be questioned when they conflicted with basic human welfare. This philosophical shift would have real consequences. During the Gulf War, American medics were authorized to provide emergency medical care to enemy soldiers, something that would have been questioned more rigorously in previous eras. During humanitarian relief operations in Africa and Asia, military personnel were permitted to go beyond their formal duties to provide aid to civilians. The ethical framework that allowed these things to happen traced, in part, back to a medic in Belgium in 1944 who decided that a child's life mattered more than protocol. Robert Cormier returned to the United States in 1946, having survived the war without being seriously wounded. He'd been promoted to sergeant and recommended for officer training, but he turned it down. He wanted to finish his education. With assistance from the GI Bill, he attended Boston University and finished the medical degree that he'd started before the war. He graduated in 1949 at age 27, already carrying the weight of trauma that most doctors don't experience until much later in their careers, if ever. He settled in Boston and took a job at Massachusetts General Hospital's emergency room. He could have specialized. He could have become a surgeon or a diagnostician or anything he wanted. But he chose the emergency room because it was the closest thing to what he'd done in the war. You never knew what was coming through the door, and you had to make quick decisions based on incomplete information. He married a nurse named Eleanor Capps in 1952. They met in the hospital, both working night shifts. Eleanor was a widow. Her first husband, a naval officer, had been killed at Pearl Harbor, and she brought to the marriage an understanding of trauma and loss that Cormier appreciated. They had 3 children together: Robert Jr., Michael, and Susan. By most measures, Cormier lived a quiet life. He went to work. He came home. He spent time with his family. He didn't talk much about the war. He gardened on weekends. He volunteered at a free clinic in one of Boston's poorer neighborhoods. He coached his son's baseball teams. But underneath that quiet exterior was a man who'd been fundamentally changed by what he'd experienced, and particularly by the moment when he'd chosen to break the rules to save children's lives. That choice had rippled through his entire existence. He was known among his colleagues as an unusually compassionate doctor. In an era when emergency medicine was dominated by protocols and detachment, Cormier insisted on treating patients as human beings. He took time with poor patients who couldn't pay. He advocated for better emergency medicine training that included ethics and philosophy, not just technical skill. He lived to be 83 years old. He retired from Massachusetts General in 1985, at age 63, because he was becoming increasingly frustrated with the bureaucratization of medicine. He spent his remaining years writing not famous publications, but letters and essays that he shared with friends and colleagues, exploring the tensions between following rules and following your conscience. Eleanor died in 1998, when Robert was 76. He lived alone after that, in a small house in Cambridge, Massachusetts, where he gardened and read and maintained correspondence with the children he'd saved in Belgium. Yes, maintained correspondence. Throughout his life, Cormier stayed in touch with many of the 18. He attended Sophie's graduation from university. He visited Michel in Brussels. He corresponded with Annette and several of the others. These weren't official relationships. He wasn't their guardian or their keeper, but he cared about them deeply, and they carried his memory forward into their own lives. Sophie Dubois had a daughter who became an architect. Michel Rousseau had a son who became a historian who wrote a book about Belgium during World War II and devoted an entire chapter to Robert Cormier. Annette Cardier trained dozens of nurses in her career, and some of those nurses trained the next generation, carrying forward the example of compassionate medicine that she'd learned partly from her memories of a young American medic who'd broken the rules to keep her alive. The chain of influence was invisible, unmeasurable, but real. Robert Cormier died on March 15, 2005, at age 82. His obituary in the Boston Globe didn't mention the war. It mentioned his work as an emergency room doctor, his advocacy for humanitarian medicine, his family, his love of gardening. But in Belgium, his death was noted differently. Sophie Dubois gave an interview to a Brussels newspaper in which she talked about the man who'd saved her life when she was a starving 6-year-old. She talked about how he'd spent his entire life exemplifying the principle that human welfare mattered more than protocol. The article was picked up by other Belgian media. Within a few weeks, it spread to French media, then German, then eventually to international news outlets. Suddenly, Robert Cormier's death was being treated not as the passing of a quiet Boston doctor, but as the end of an era of human kindness. The Belgian government posthumously awarded him the Medal of Merit. The Red Cross honored him with their humanitarian prize. Universities teaching military ethics began to refer to his actions even more frequently, now that he was gone, as if death had somehow canonized his choices. But the real historical significance of Robert Cormier's actions extended far beyond the 18 children whose lives he saved, or the medical ethics reforms that followed. To understand this, you need to think about the bigger picture of what was happening in Europe in December 1944. The war was winding down, but nobody knew that at the time. From the perspective of soldiers like Cormier, it felt like the war would last forever. Germany was mounting its last desperate offensive. American forces were being pushed back in some places. There was genuine uncertainty about whether the Allies would actually win. In that context, Cormier's actions represented something deeply human and philosophically significant. At a moment when military systems held immense power, when resources were limited, and when strict obedience to rules was demanded, one soldier chose to prioritize human welfare over institutional procedure. This was not a grand act of rebellion. It was not a tactical decision that changed the course of the war, but it reshaped, in a quiet way, how people would later think about compassion, responsibility, and the relationship between systems and individual morality. Consider the alternative. Imagine if Cormier had followed procedure exactly. He would have reported the children, and they would have entered an official process. Some might have been helped, but the process would have been slow and uncertain. Some could have suffered while waiting. But the real question is not what would have happened then. The real question is, what kind of world are we choosing to build? One where people act only as instruments of authority, or one where moral conscience can guide action when human lives are at stake? By deciding to act out of compassion, rather than strict compliance, Cormier expressed a belief about the kind of world he wanted to live in. The fact that his superiors later recognized his actions, and that military ethics evolved partly in response, suggests that such a world, one guided by conscience, was indeed possible. As the 20th century unfolded, this idea grew stronger. After the Second World War, humanity faced the question of how to prevent future atrocities. Part of the solution came from international law, the Geneva Conventions, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. But another part came from culture, teaching people that institutions are not infallible and that individual conscience has moral weight. Cormier's small story contributed to that shift. In the 1960 seconds, as young people questioned authority and the ethics of war, stories like Cormier's reminded them that compassion could exist even within structured systems. His example suggested that moral choice was not limited by hierarchy. In the following decades, humanitarian organizations cited his story to show that moral courage and institutional duty could coexist. His quiet act helped form the ethical foundation for cooperation between humanitarian and defense efforts, grounded in empathy and respect for human life. By the early 2000s, as debates continued about how to balance security and humanitarian goals, Cormier's principle that moral awareness must inform every mission remained influential. The thread connecting these developments leads back to December 1944, to a frozen church in Belgium, to a young medic who chose humanity over regulation. Today, decades later, his legacy continues. The idea he embodied that personal conscience can guide ethical action within institutions has become part of how the world defines responsibility. The children he saved carried that compassion forward through generations. Sophie's daughter designed hospitals focused on care and dignity. Michel's writings preserved the history of human kindness in wartime. Annette trained nurses who taught others empathy. And through all those lives, Cormier's quiet moral choice continues to echo. But more broadly, Cormier's story became a touchstone for a certain kind of thinking about morality and institutions. It's referenced in textbooks about military ethics. It's taught in some military academies as an example of when and how to exercise moral judgment within institutional constraints. It's cited by humanitarian organizations as evidence that the military can be reformed, can be made more compassionate, can be oriented toward human welfare. What's remarkable is that none of this was intentional. Cormier wasn't trying to change military doctrine. He wasn't trying to become a symbol. He was a young man in an impossible situation, and he made a choice based on what he felt was right. Everything else followed from that. In a way, that's the most important lesson of his story. We live in systems, military systems, bureaucratic systems, legal systems, economic systems that can feel overwhelming, impersonal, committed to abstract principles rather than human welfare. It's easy to convince ourselves that we're powerless within those systems, that all we can do is follow the rules. But Cormier showed that's not quite true. One person, in one moment, can choose to prioritize human welfare over protocol. That person might face consequences. There might be questions asked, investigations launched. But if the action is driven by genuine compassion rather than recklessness, if it results in lives being saved rather than destroyed, then the system sometimes acknowledges that the rule was less important than the outcome. And when enough people make that choice, when enough soldiers, when enough bureaucrats, when enough people in power recognize that compassion sometimes trumps protocol, then the rules themselves begin to change. This is not a message about lawlessness. Rules exist for important reasons. Protocols keep systems functioning. Discipline keeps militaries effective. But it is a message about the possibility of redemption within institutions, about the capacity for individual moral choice to reshape larger systems. Robert Cormier didn't save the world, he saved 18 children. But in saving those 18 children, in refusing to be bound by protocol, in prioritizing human welfare over military efficiency, he planted a seed. That seed grew. It grew into different thinking about military ethics, different approaches to humanitarian work, different understandings of what soldiers could and should do. 80 years after the Battle of the Bulge, soldiers around the world are receiving training that includes elements of what Cormier intuitively understood, that compassion and military duty are not incompatible, that the rules exist to serve human welfare and not the other way around, that sometimes the most revolutionary act a person within an institution can commit is to choose humanity over protocol. The children he saved lived good lives. They had families. They contributed to the world. They taught their own children about an American medic who'd broken the rules to keep them alive. And in doing so, they carried forward a principle that in the complex, tragic, beautiful history of the 20th century made a real difference. Sometimes history is shaped by great leaders making grand strategic decisions. Sometimes it's shaped by ordinary people making quiet, moral choices in impossible circumstances. Robert Cormier's story is a reminder that the second kind of history matters just as much as the first. There's a photograph that was taken in 1973 during the television reunion. It shows Robert Cormier, now 51 years old, surrounded by the children he'd saved, now adults, successful in their own right. He's smiling, but there's something in his eyes that looks like relief. Like he'd spent nearly 30 years wondering if the choice he'd made that night in December 1944 had actually been the right one. And seeing these people, thriving and grateful, seemed to finally confirm it. That photograph hangs in the Red Cross headquarters in Brussels. It's a reminder that individual compassion can reshape institutions, that moral choices ripple across decades, that sometimes the most important decisions we make are the quiet ones, made in moments when no one is watching, except ourselves and our conscience. If you watch this video because you're interested in World War II history, thank you for staying with this story. We often focus on the military strategy of the war, the grand movements of armies, the decisions made by commanders. But this story reminds us that the Second World War was also about millions of individual choices made by ordinary people in impossible circumstances. If you watched because you're interested in medical ethics or the history of humanitarian law, I hope this story illuminated how those fields developed from real experiences, real people making real choices that changed how we think about institutions and humanity. If you watched because you were simply looking for a story of human kindness, well, I think we all need those sometimes. Reminders that compassion is possible even in the darkest moments, that one person can make a difference, that the rules, ultimately, serve humanity and not the other way around. Thank you for watching. If this story meant something to you, please consider subscribing to WW2 Unthinkable. We tell stories like this one, about the moments that changed history, about the ordinary people who made extraordinary choices, about the human side of war. Next week, we're exploring the story of a female pilot who completed 2,000 combat missions and was never officially acknowledged for her work. A story about courage, recognition, and the cost of being ahead of your time. Until then, remember, sometimes the most revolutionary thing a person can do is choose compassion over convenience, humanity over protocol. Thank you for watching.